Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guests today are Jason Nee, a principal cyber architect for the civil group at Leidos, and Richard Wheeler, an enterprise network solutions architect at Leidos. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Glad to be here.
Awesome. Great to have you here. And obviously we're talking about how agencies are really adopting cloud environments at different levels of maturity, but it seems as if almost every agency is going to multiple hosting environments in some form or fashion. And that brings a lot of challenges to how they can actually oversee that type of framework. And Richard, if we can just start with you, I mean, how do you kind of minimize that technical complexity while still getting the most out of a multi-cloud approach?
It's something that we have seen before. History oftentimes repeats itself, and we see a lot of analogies in the multi-cloud to what we have seen in the past with enterprise hosting, whether that hosting was a single location or multiple locations, DR, high availability sites, and those kinds of things. We needed to host in multiple locations. In addition to that, we also found that we had the multiple server vendors, for example, that we had to support, multiple storage vendors, multiple infrastructure, and with that brought along a requirement to have multiple SMEs or security experts or operational experts that gave us then the operational expertise to operate that multi-environment, if you will. But we still have to be concerned with and manage our budget because complexity is oftentimes directly related to the complexity of the environment, the number of features and the capabilities that we have to try to bring into this multi-cloud environment.
Yeah, so in some ways it's not anything entirely new. Agencies have always had to deal with multiple IT service providers, different ways, but obviously the cloud brings a new element in terms of the scale of compute and things like that. So
exactly.
Yeah. And then Jason, if we can turn to you, obviously security teams are pretty well versed in how they lock down those traditional environments, but what are some of the first steps in terms of managing security in a multi-cloud environment?
So that's a great question. When you move from a traditional data center to a multi-cloud environment, many things changes. And in terms of security, right, you're moving from traditionally you could deploy a firewall, IPS and that type of security tool to a brand new environment that embrace today's modern cloud-based technologies, which also bring in a new set of cloud tools which we had never seen before. So to start with, obviously, we always start with building what we call a cloud-centric, security foundation. In practical experience, we typically will build something called a landing zone for cloud implementation. Basically, it's really a security template that you could use to rapidly deploy security tools and with all the compliance and all the requirements implemented very fast, in a very short time frame, without going to each individual CSP for different type of tool you have to learn, process you have to learn, and then reduce your deployment cycle, and then achieve your authorization to operate in a much faster manner.
I see. That makes sense. I mean, you want to have kind of a uniform, streamlined process and not do each cloud service provider in a piecemeal fashion. I'm wondering, the CISO, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, has put out a lot of guidance on how to adopt cloud securely, things like the Cloud Security Technical Reference Architecture, trusted internet connections. I'm just wondering, how have you seen those documents kind of evolving and helping agencies do this faster, more streamlined, and in a way that they can be assured that their data is secure?
Certainly. Well, in the last 6 months or so, right, we've been seeing a lot of these newer, security executive orders and newer style security requirements, coming down, from the federal government. As you mentioned, we have Take 3.0 requirement, which is relatively new. We have Executive Order 14028, which is, just came out, in 2021. And then a very detailed implementation plan for Zero Trust, which is what we call M2209. All these requirements, they overlap to a degree, yet, each provides some very specific guidance on how should you be doing security in today's modern world in the cloud environment. Specifically in M2209 Zero Trust implementation, the policy guidance laid out some very specific control requirements for when you operate, either in cloud or even not in the cloud, in each of the 5 pillars that they, describe, and what type of control requirement need to be implemented to secure that environment. In turn, really just to achieve, once you operate in the cloud environment, you could really secure all the data in that environment. In the meantime, you have the level of trust that you have, for your organization.
Yeah, I mean that zero trust strategy is really galvanizing a lot of cybersecurity actions across agencies. A key pillar, you mentioned the pillar approach rather, identity is one of those key pillars of a zero trust infrastructure. I was wondering, can you kind of help us understand what that means, especially identity in a cloud environment? For either of you, how do you kind of secure identity in that zero trust environment, whether it's cloud or otherwise?
Certainly, identity is really becoming the new perimeter for our infrastructure, right? As the enterprise is branching into multiple clouds, into the various hosting environments, whether that is a hybrid model, an on-premise model, or even a SaaS environment, it's really putting a tremendous amount of pressure on the traditional perimeter edge, where we were able to manage how do we get to remote workers, workers at home, workers that are working from hotel type locations or cafes, coffee shops, those kinds of things. It makes it really, really challenging to secure that perimeter across there. So what we have found is that the traditional build the castle walls and then build the VPN access is really broken as we get to the multi-cloud environment. We need to move beyond that so that identity becomes really that control point, if you will, for access to both the resources, applications, and the data sets that are in there. For us to safeguard access to the data, it's critical that, again, identity becomes the hallmark to everything that we're doing, both for the user but also for the device. I no longer can depend upon the location that device or that user is at, right? So location becomes, we don't want to say not as important, but it becomes less of an ironclad control point that we could say, if they're coming from that point, then they're safe, they're secure, right? I have to really depend upon the combination of the user identity and the device identity together to determine whether or not I can trust that user, trust that access, and really be able to control that on a packet by packet basis as we're accessing those resources.
Yeah, I mean that's a great point, and I like the phrase identity as the new perimeter, because obviously zero trust is really about collapsing the notion of relying on the traditional perimeter for security. And Jason, just to follow up to that, follow up on what Richard was talking about, are there other ways, other approaches to really key in on identity, especially in cloud services, considering cloud services are becoming the next generation of IT infrastructure for agencies?
Certainly. So this is really a mindset change, right? Traditionally, in a data center, right, you tell people that, I have a firewall, I have my access list, and I secure all the traffic going in and out of my data center, right? So I could, sit back and relax. But that's not the case anymore when you're in a multi-cloud environment, mainly because, you have different, CSP zones, and you have different VPCs, and all this, becomes very dynamic, right? It changes constantly. So how do we meet this challenge, in a newer, cloud-based environment? That's where, we come to talk about, use identity as a foundation for secure access. And we will trust the access based on who the user is, and when the user is accessing, and what type of access the user should be having. And tie that, to our actual architecture design. We talk about the 5 pillars and zero trust. And identity actually is the sort of corners foundation for that type of control access. With that to begin with, then you can build out access on that foundation to really making sure the user, along with the device that the user is using, can access the environment correctly. We introduced some of the concept called PDP, which again it's a very zero trust specific. And then you use that to control all the access, in the entire, environment you are managing, right? So the bottom line is that we are moving away from the traditional parameter network-based parameter control to this newer style access really based on the actual user along with the secure device that they're using.
Got it. And I'm wondering, as agencies kind of move away from owning and operating their own data centers to really using cloud services and cloud service providers, how does it change the dynamic in terms of what they have to concern themselves with from a security standpoint, from things like we just talked about with identity? I don't know if you have any thoughts on how agencies should really be working with cloud service providers and companies who serve as a go-between to really make sure that everyone is aware of their security obligations in kind of this new paradigm.
Certainly, one of the things that we're seeing in that is it really starts with establishing what is the governance supposed to look and feel like for this multi-cloud environment, right? So I need to establish that policy, and the agencies, and in most cases, our enterprises are really good at establishing that,
yeah.
right? They know what is supposed to be happening, and then how then do I take that policy and distribute it to all the different cloud hosting environments so that we can make effective real-time decisions against that policy as accesses are occurring across the infrastructure, across the servers, the data sets, and those types of things, right? And as Jason said, the PDP, or the policy decision point, needs to live within each of those CSPs. I can't afford to have that centralized and then backhaul all that traffic or make all those decisions centrally and then try to push that back into the cloud environment for enforcement, right? So it's really important that we have a distributed zero trust environment that works across all of the different clouds. And as I bring multiple clouds together, I need to replicate that across, again, the multiple cloud instances so that I have an effective enforcement at the edge, at the server, at the resource, again, in real time, so that as incidents are occurring, I can shut that off and stop that access immediately without having a latency involved with that while I get back to the central environment to make that decision back and forth. So it really is very, very important that, again, the Leidos PDP is a critical component to make that work effectively.
Got it. All right. I wanted to turn to a little bit of a different topic. Just there's this sort of effort to federate services across multiple CSPs to make sense of, what's out there, right? How should agencies be approaching that? How should agencies be kind of trying to organize their approach to this multiple hosting environment going forward?
So first of all, right, when you started to design a multi-cloud environment, obviously you start the actual architecture design. That's when you need to bring in a framework, right? What type of security framework you're using to design such a new environment. The challenge usually comes down to the different CSPs. Each of them have different controls. They use different tool sets, and they use different management portals. And it becomes a challenge for you to train your staff to gather expertise, to understand all different CSP environments. You may have an expert that knows a lot more about Amazon, right? And then suddenly you start to learn about Oracle, Microsoft Azure, right? So that may become a technical gap. So the challenge is how do you bridge that gap, right? And how do you get yourself ready in a very short time frame, so that you can get your entire infrastructure to be migrated into the cloud, with security really built in. So that's where we want to really talk about what type of cloud agnostic tools we'll be using versus using the cloud native tools. This is also to balance the actual cost and the implementation time cycle. When you use the native tools, obviously it's much faster, right, if you already build into the cloud environment. However, down the road, it may increase your actual overhead and workload, because you manage so many different tools simultaneously. So in Leidos, obviously, we design the solution based on the different customer needs. In some cases, we might use more, cloud-based native tools. In a larger environment, with more complexity, we may go into, cloud agnostic tools, right, to try to bring everything, we call single pane of glass for management and also for security monitoring as well, really to reduce the actual training and skill level needs for the staff. In the meantime, you're maintaining the actual security posture.
Got it.
Yeah, so in addition to that, we really have to focus on the cost side of that, right? So we bring these multiple clouds, multiple services, multiple features and capabilities within the multiple clouds, but we have to also keep in mind that we've got budgets that we have to try to manage against that, right? While it's interesting that I can have all of these resources working in the various clouds, but I need to think about how do I do the cost of data exfiltration across them. How do I manage and not have redundant services within that service catalog of the aggregated capabilities? And how do I align that to the various business elements that are subscribing to it so that I have an effective chargeback or showback mechanism so that the business units that are consuming this multi-cloud environment have visibility into what it is that they're spending, what are they responsible for, within that resource environment. Whether we map that to a TBM or a TBM-like type of environment, or we simply do it more at an aggregate of a tenant level, multi-cloud brings a lot of unique challenges to this cost side of it that we really have to stay focused on in order to effectively operate into a cloud.
Got it. I mean, to each of your points, one key aspect of security is obviously log information. As we saw, in the SolarWinds incident, for instance, I'm wondering, each of the cloud service providers delivers security services and log information a little bit differently, perhaps at different costs than each other. How do agencies kind of get their arms around that from a policy standpoint, from an auditing standpoint, given how central logs are to security programs?
Yeah, certainly. One of the challenges that we have here when we go to cloud native capabilities, and then within each of the individual CSPs, as Jason mentioned earlier, they all have their unique APIs that they expose for the services that they're providing to us, and in turn, then the logs all look and feel different. So I no longer have the luxury of putting up a big data lake, bringing all of this log data from in a premise environment together and then analyze it, right? I need to be able to look at all of this log, security log, performance log, event log type of information, where it's at, analyze it effectively, and then be able to act upon that across all of the different CSPs that I'm using. Again, I simply can't afford from an egress perspective to just drag all that data together out of AWS and Google and so on and so forth, and then analyze it. I have to be able to analyze it in place and then be effective in producing those alerts against it so that our security professionals can take action in real time to shut down any potential breaches that are going on.
Jason,
so Richard's right.
Yeah.
So the traditional data lake concept, it's pretty much not applicable in a multi-cloud environment because you're talking about a very large amount of log, from different CSPs. How do you interrogate that type of log in a very timely fashion and extract only meaningful information for your monitoring purpose? So it brings a new challenge of how do you actually interpret all this logging information from different CSP and bring them to what we call a single pane of glass for your security team to act on. Because the visibility is still the king, right? You want to have visibility into your environment. Therefore, it brings in the challenge of deciding the proper logging architecture, right? How do you, not moving a large amount of log across different CSP boundaries. In the meantime, you still maintain visibility into all the environment that you're managing, right? So architecture for log monitoring becomes the key. And also because of a large amount of data, a lot of the manual type of analysis is no longer enough. You need to bring in a lot of the modern technology in cloud for using data analytics, machine learning, and which is what we call the SOAR capability, right? In today's, in security monitoring world, not in addition to the SIEM tool that we used to have. Therefore, you could, automate a lot of these detections, and also, bring in intelligence from different, data feeds, and then react to it in much faster fashion, right? And then provide better instant response capabilities overall.
That single pane of glass concept, using artificial intelligence, machine learning, all those things, is that something mature organizations are doing today? Have they achieved that, or is that still more aspirational?
So today, for example, with Leidos, right? We have already been helping customers to implement this type of solution in different cloud environments, right? Really, because what you're seeing the challenges to tackle, this type of, multi-cloud environment security monitoring, you have to have these tools in place to do it effectively in a, very cost, effective manner, so that you don't have to bring in, a very large team of, security analysts, to provide 24/7 support, right? So you got to gain the efficiencies there. And to do that, right, so we have to get this actually implemented in the environment, and we are actually actively helping customers, implementing this type of solutions.
Got it. One thing we haven't talked about yet today is just the authority to operate process is obviously critical for agencies as they want to adopt some of these tools that we're talking about. Do you guys have any lessons learned, any thoughts on how the ATO process can be streamlined and just done in the best way possible to really adopt some of these tools?
Certainly. So Leidos, one of the largest provider for IT services of the government, right? So certainly, we have a team that had done many different ATOs, for different agencies. Traditionally, you in the data center, right? You have different applications, and you can do one ATO for your data center, and then do on top of the applications as well. But once you're in the cloud, this becomes a much bigger challenge, because each cloud likely you have to do ATO, and then each application you run on the top of that. The number of ATOs have increased, substantially. How can you do it effectively? So we have been helping customers to understand in the cloud environment roles and responsibilities for different controls, right? You have controls that you could inherit from the CSPs, and you have controls that you as a cloud tenant that you have to implement yourself. And then of course, organization, you have some controls you can inherit, as your part of organization implementation. How do you break this down to different segments and then do this in an efficient way? Typically, we will try to provide what we call a packaged ATO solution, and in that case, reduce the amount of time for each cloud tenant or cloud customers when they try to do their own ATOs. You can do it in a much more efficient manner and use some of the reuse package that we had developed, and reduce your time to put together your SSP, your compliance reports, and also the ongoing O&M initiative or effort as well. Just to gain more efficiency for the overall security cycle management.
As we look at this, we like to try to keep it simple as we can, in that the cloud providers have excellent tools in the various things, and they have controls built into their system that we typically leverage. As we, again, in multi-cloud, the real possibility of having an application distributed across multiple clouds operating in that environment, and then as disaster recovery or high availability dictates, I may have part of the application running in one provider while a database lives somewhere else, and making that work effectively. So I need to be able to have those controls that are native to each of the CSPs aggregated together into that authority to operate, so that I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel or trying to figure out, oh my goodness, how am I going to get that application moved over there? We've already determined how that ATO process, have approval for those controls, and we're just simply inheriting those and then passing them down to the end compute environment to maintain that continuous ATO availability across that application that is running.
Got it. All right, well, we've covered a lot of security considerations for folks who are interested in moving to the cloud, but of course need to have security at the top of their mind as well, or interested in adopting cloud services, multi-cloud services, things like that. Any final thoughts that either of you would want to leave us with here on just security in the multi-cloud? Richard, we'll start with you, and then Jason.
Certainly, one of the big key takeaways that we see here is that zero trust within a multi-cloud environment is a pretty critical component to get established from the beginning. We find it difficult on the premise enterprise to get zero trust implemented with a lot of the legacy that we have. We have a unique opportunity in multi-cloud to be able to implement that from the beginning, so that we have our governance established at the top, with the policy distributed into all the various clouds, and effectively then manage and monitor that infrastructure and all those applications that are operating in that environment in near real time, so that we're not trying to bolt it on later on. So it is truly part of the solution from the very beginning, so that our management overlay across this multiple cloud environment. Multiple clouds are effective without, once again, aggregating all the data and trying to make all those decisions in a single location.
Jason, any final thoughts?
The main point I want to make is, one is security first. Like Richard mentioned, you build all the security controls and components into the design from day one, map each of those tools to your different 5 pillars in the zero trust actual framework, and then try to automate a lot of this, implementation and actual ATO process as much as possible to gain efficiency. And then finally, focus on continuous monitoring, use some of the modern tools in clouds, and use some of the newest technology, right, with machine learning and SOAR capabilities to actually gain efficiency, for security monitoring and overall improving the overall security posture.
Got it. All right. Well, thank you for your thoughts today, gentlemen.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right. And again, I'd like to thank today's guests, Jason Nee, a principal cyber architect for the Civil Group at Leidos, and Richard Wheeler, an enterprise network solutions architect at Leidos. I'm your moderator, Justin Doubleday, and you're listening to Federal News Network. Now let me send you back to the studio for more on the Cloud Exchange.